This is Lesson 842, Revolution in France, 1789 to 1791. How did the events of 1789 result in a constitutional monarchy in France, and what were the consequences? People take the longest possible paths, digress to numerous dead ends, and make all kinds of mistakes. Then historians come along and write summaries of this messy, nonlinear process and make it appear like a simple, straight line. Dean Kamen. This presentation is just a very brief overview of a vast topic. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go much further. But if you would like to explore this topic in more depth, check out my 16 lessons on the French Revolution, the French Republic, and the Age of Napoleon on the YouTube channel. Focus questions. What factors contributed to the start of the French Revolution? What previous document most influenced the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen? Which political philosopher is the likely origin for the ideas included in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen? What Enlightenment ideas most inspired the French Revolution? And how did the American colonies and France differ at the beginning of their two revolutions? And in what way did the American and French revolutions attain similar results? Key concepts of the French Revolution: estate, bourgeoisie, the tennis court oath, National Assembly, and the Bastille. French society. French society was divided into three what were called estates. What is an estate? Well, the term estate refers to a state of being, like in Spanish, ¿Cómo estás? Estoy bien. How is it? It is well. So you could say that in French society there were three states of being. And the estates were divided this way. You had the first estate, and that was the clergy. You had the second estate, and that was the nobility. And then the third estate was everybody else, the other 95% of the population of France. Let's talk about that third estate, which almost everybody belonged to. Only the third estate paid any taxes, and they paid all the taxes. They had almost no representation in the government, and the third estate consisted of the working poor and the peasants. But the third estate also had a rising middle class in it, and these people were called the bourgeoisie. They were people like doctors, lawyers, merchants, government officials, professional people. And they didn't have noble titles or church offices, but they were wealthy, they were educated, and they were urban. And they wanted more power and more representation in the government. And the bourgeoisie were going to contribute greatly to this French Revolution. The Estates General. The Estates General was the French legislature, like England's Parliament or the United States Congress. It hadn't had an assembly, a meeting, since the year 1614, and that was 175 years previously. It had representatives from all three estates. Traditionally, each estate of the three got one vote. And under those conditions, the first and second estates could easily outvote the third estate every time, 2-1. France was in a severe financial crisis. While the American colonies enjoyed a high standard of living at the start of the American Revolution, France, on the other hand, had severe economic problems at the start of the French Revolution. France had crushing war debt, largely because of the American Revolution. France had had a series of bad harvests, and therefore there was not enough food for everyone. And there was massive unemployment. The government was broke and had no more credit with the banks. King Louis XVI finally got to a point where he had no choice but to call the Estates General to an assembly in July 1788. Like I said, for the first time in 175 years. So there had to be elections for new representatives and everything. The common people of France had high hopes that this new meeting of the Estates General could help them out of their dire economic situation, and they followed every detail in the newspapers. Paris, in particular, was a hotbed of excitement and intense discussion about how this was all playing out. Louis XVI was not the decisive leader that his great-great-great-grandfather Louis XIV had been. He was a nice guy, he had the best of intentions, but he was indecisive to a fault, and he was too eager to please. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was very unpopular, and she was known for extravagant spending and for immoral behavior. The Estates General finally met on May the 5th, 1789, at the Palace of Versailles. It had 1,200 delegates, representatives, and the Third Estate had more delegates than the First Estate and the Second Estates combined. And the big question was, would the voting be one man, one vote, or would it be one estate, one vote? If it was to be one man, one vote, the Third Estate would have the numerical advantage and things could actually get done. The Third Estate representatives were all from that bourgeoisie that we talked about, that rising middle class in the Third Estate. And they wanted a constitution like Britain and the U.S. had. They wanted France to have a constitutional monarchy, and they wanted the First and Second Estates to finally start paying taxes. But if the vote was to be one estate, one vote, then the nobles and the clergy would have the numerical advantage in voting. And what did the First and Second Estates care if the people were starving? They just wanted to keep their privileges. The First and Second Estates decided to go with the ever-popular one estate, one vote procedure. The Third Estate delegates refused to go along with that. And on June the 17th, 1789, after 3 days of gridlock and bickering, the Third Estate met without the First and Second Estates. But they no longer called themselves the Third Estate. They now called themselves the National Assembly. And they claimed under this name to represent not just the Third Estate, but all of France. And they were determined to write a constitution for France without the First and Second Estates if necessary. The Tennis Court Oath. On June the 20th, 1789, the Third Estate gathered at its meeting hall in the Palace of Versailles. The hall was locked and guarded. There's some debate over the government's intentions by doing this. Some believe that the janitor had just innocently locked the door. But at any rate, the assembly moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. It was actually a handball court, but they called it a tennis court. It was big, with seats for spectators, etc. And every member of this National Assembly took an oath then and there to support each other. They took an oath that they would continue to meet until a new constitution was written, and that they would not let anyone stop them from meeting. And the people of Paris avidly followed every detail of these new events. Louis XVI had a two-faced response to the so-called National Assembly and its tennis court oath. 4 days after this happened, Louis XVI made a speech, and he praised the National Assembly for what they were doing. And Louis demanded that the First and Second Estates jump on board and join them. The Estates General would be over, and everyone would belong to this new National Assembly. But at the same time, Louis was amassing a really scary 18,000-man army outside of Paris, and its purpose was to march on Paris and shut down popular support for this new National Assembly that was getting the people of Paris so excited, if that were to become necessary. Louis XVI also fired his finance minister, Jacques Necker. Necker had been a liberal, and Necker had been supportive of the Third Estate, and he had insisted that the only way out of France's financial crisis was to have a tax on property. In other words, the nobles would have to pay taxes, and the church would have to pay taxes. Many people viewed Jacques Necker as the guy who was going to save France from financial disaster. And Necker's firing was seen as a move favoring the nobles and the clergy. Bastille Day, July 14th, 1789. The people of Paris heard about this 18,000-man army coming. They were afraid of being killed, and hundreds of revolutionaries stormed the Bastille looking for weapons to defend themselves. The Bastille was the royal prison, And the rioters found only a few rifles and they found only a few prisoners. But they conquered the Bastille after an intense, hours-long battle with the guards. And they even cut the head off the Bastille's governor in the street. The Bastille marked the first time that the common and poor people of France stood up to fight for themselves. And it sparked peasant insurrections against nobles all over France. The popular thing for these peasants to do was this. They would go in, ransack the nobles' manors, and then they would burn any documents that recorded how much money the peasants owed to their nobles. All of this led to what was called the Great Fear that went on in July and August 1789. And this phase, known as the Great Fear, shows the centuries-old power of intimidation that the nobles still held over the peasants. A great fear swept through the peasants that the nobles would hire criminals and marauders to come back at them for revenge for what they had done. And this sparked even more violence. So now there is this spiraling situation: insurrection, fear of reprisal, therefore more insurrection, and therefore more fear of reprisal, getting out of control. The official recognition of the National Assembly. To quell all of this violence from the Great Fear that we just talked about, Louis XVI officially withdrew those troops that he had from outside of Paris. He also recalled Jacques Necker back to his post as France's finance minister. And these two things meant that this new National Assembly had won. The Third Estate was finally free of the other two estates, and now they could go to work, creating a new French government. The National Assembly went to work on August the 4th, 1789. They passed sweeping reforms in favor of common people. They abolished many noble privileges. They abolished church tithes. They issued the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And this document declared a government by popular sovereignty, not divine right. You can think of popular sovereignty as the exact opposite of divine right. And this document declared all Frenchmen, not French women yet, to be free and equal. It was highly influenced by the American Declaration of Independence, and it was also highly influenced by the Enlightenment ideals of natural rights, which John Locke had advocated, and we've studied all about that. It established the government's role in protecting people's rights. The National Assembly drafted a new constitution, and it specified a constitutional monarchy, and that meant that Louis XVI was still the king. He was still on the throne at Versailles. And remember that the National Assembly also met at Versailles. The consequences of the National Assembly's actions. There were consequences for the nobles. Many of those nobles fled the country when they heard this news. And because of this, the market for luxury goods that they bought all the time collapsed, and so did lots of jobs for common people who made those goods. And there were consequences for the poor. They became even hungrier as a result of all this, and unemployment climbed even higher. And there are even consequences for poor women. Women traditionally ran the household finances, and now they couldn't rely on church help anymore because the church couldn't collect any more tithes. The March on Versailles, October 5th, 1789. Finally, several thousand Parisian fishwives got sick of the chronic shortages of bread and other goods. And fishwives were commoner women who sold all kinds of items on the street, not just fish. They marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles to demand action from both the king and the National Assembly. And by the time they got there, they were tired, hungry, and angry. They disrupted the National Assembly, which was in session at the time, and they even killed some bodyguards. The royal family was barely saved by the National Guard, and Louis XVI agreed to leave Versailles and live in the capital, Paris. And the entire royal family moved to their city palace of Tuileries in Paris the next day. And the family never returned to the Palace of Versailles again. Once again, for the second time, the common people of Paris had pushed the revolution forward on their own power. The constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI took an oath to the new constitution in July 1790. He had to stay in Paris permanently, and this new constitution did several things. For one, it reorganized the way France was administered. France would now have 83 what were called departments, kind of like our 50 states. And the Constitution nationalized Catholic Church property. And they used this church property to do two things. Number one, back a new French currency, and they used it to boost France's finances. And finally, this new constitution forced the clergy to take an oath of loyalty to the French state. And priests could now even be chosen by voters. It abolished inherited nobility. It abolished trade guilds. It gave women many more rights. They still couldn't vote, and they still couldn't hold public office. And this included playwright Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges wrote the now famous Declaration of the Rights of Woman, and this work was largely ignored by France's leadership until she was later executed, supposedly for supporting the king and queen. It was looking like the revolution was over, and France's future as a new, egalitarian, constitutional monarchy was bright. But people soon realized it wasn't going to be as easy as all that.